Alright guys, today we're talking about the Indus Valley Civilization. The Indus Valley Civilization was the precursor to India. They were from that region and developed around 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, and really had a quite different civilization than what we'll see when we talk about India, as well as really the regions that we are looking at so far. And what I hope that you take from this is not only like why they had a different civilization, but also when we talk about the Minoans a little bit later, the similarities that you see. Because the Indus Valley civilizations, along with the Minoans, have a lot of similarities that take place. Now, we have to, with these civilizations, look at them in kind of like we do with prehistory, because while they had writing, it has not been deciphered. And therefore, unfortunately, all of that writing is inaccessible to us. And so you're left with having to use archaeological evidence and what you kind of know from the region, and what we find from other societies that showcase the Indus Valley civilizations, to interpret and understand what their societies were like. So of course that's going to leave us with a lot of limitations, and there definitely is this aspect of we don't know. This is our best guess. It potentially could be this, because we can't read the writing that they left us. So just keep that in mind, in that, that kind of each section that we're looking at today isn't as detailed or robust as some of what we looked at with Mesopotamia and Egypt. And part of that reason comes from the fact that we don't have writing. Even though they had writing, we don't have their writing interpreted to be able to fill in some of the blanks, or maybe some of the questions that we might have that archaeology just doesn't answer, right? It can provide a lot, but ultimately it's not going to give us everything we'd like. The other thing that's interesting with them is that they didn't leave a lot of kind of pictorial narratives. One of the things that can help, besides kind of like when you're digging for archaeological evidence and finding ruins and things that they left behind, is that if you have a lot of pictures, of images that are painted, that showcase daily life, that showcase things of import, it isn't as good as writing, but is an addition and filler to the archaeological evidence. And unfortunately, while they did have artwork, and we'll take a look at that, it isn't one of that kind of pictorial narrative. Okay, so that's the I guess the things to look out for, and also just kind of the forewarning, if you will, about what we're missing from this situation. So just kind of as a refresher, because, we've looked at two so far. You have the early river valley civilizations, and you definitely, the Indus Valley falls under this. And of course, I'm classifying the Indus Valley with India when we talk about the four early ones, right? Because we have Mesopotamia, which we have looked at, and you have Egypt, right? And those two we've looked at, and then we have India, and with India, right, you could say that then that's the Indus Valley, and separately India itself, and then we will be looking at China lastly. The thing with these is that what you have is, from between essentially 5,000 to 2,000 BCE, you have an increase in development and exploitation of the land. And this then leads to the development of civilizations, right? And of course, what it goes back to is within the title, the River Valley Civilizations. Why does this happen? Because really the rivers provide the opportunity for these kind of things to develop. And there's 4 kind of main things that take place in these societies, right? The very first, which we looked at, especially with Mesopotamia, because it was the first, was that it intensified agriculture. You have a rapid increase in the development of agriculture, which allows for these societies to be successful. This then is going to also be coupled with technological innovation. And for many, the reason that happened was because the rivers kind of forced that to happen. Egypt, not so much. I would argue that in some areas of technological innovation, Egypt was lacking because they didn't have to, because of the geographical nature of their region. But definitely with Mesopotamia, India, and the Indus Valley, and India, and then China, you see how that innovation propelled them forward. This then ultimately leads to the development of state powers, and then governments with kingship and things like that, and then also ultimately the construction of cities, right? And within all of that, you could argue, right, that gets you that cultural development that we look at within religion and social development. So that's kind of just a refresher of the things that we're seeing and looking at, and just once again how important these rivers were to those developments. So in the Indus Valley, you have 2 main rivers at this early stage. This is going to change when India develops as a state, and that's going to be because of climate and some earthquakes, climate, and environmental factors that take place. But you have the 2 rivers at the time of the Indus Valley civilization were the Indus and the Saraswati. Okay, oops. Remember I mentioned that all but Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China all had 2 rivers which helped propel them forward earlier than everyone else in the world. Egypt, the Nile, was sufficient with 1. But really you see that these regions play off of 2 rivers to help them be successful. So what's significant about the 2 rivers is that you have the Indus floodplain was broader than the Nile, which means that this is leaving a larger silt base behind. And that's important because that's gives rich soil for farmland, right? You have, so we'll put there, it covers more area. And the other thing that it did is it flooded twice a year. And that is also significant because that means that you can have 2 crops annually, right? So these 2 things, what they create are increased agriculture because of the rich soil. And not just the rich soil, but the large base of rich soil because of the floodplain, and 2 crops annually. And of course, if you have 2 crops annually, right, that's going to lead to a wealthier society, or we'll say civilization, because that means you have a lot more surplus available than in other societies or other locations. And we're going to see that with the Indus Valley civilizations and how that impacts them. Okay, so let's see. We're going to look at a map in just a second. I want to get a few more things, and then we'll look at the region that they're coming from. So what happens because of this, because of the larger floodplain, and because of the two crops that you can get annually from the flooding twice a year, is by the 3rd millennium, you have an explosion of growth in towns. Let's see what we'll put here. Growth in towns, and cities, and in overall the general population. And this is going to create a massive sized area and peoples for the Indus Valley. The other thing that this creates, because they have such a massive surplus, even with a large population, because that's ultimately important. Your population can only grow so much based on your food production. If you don't produce enough food, or if you produce, let's say, a lower level of food, then your population is only going to grow to meet that, right? It's kind of like the supply and demand idea. You have to have enough food to feed people, and the more food you have, then the more of a population you can have, because you can feed them, right? So population does at least initially get dictated some by the food that can be provided for the people. And so because the Indus Valley was able to have such a large surplus, they end up having a massive region of 2 larger cities, and then a whole bunch of smaller subset cities that gives a population of over 100,000, which is just massive for that time. One of the things that they do with this larger surplus that they have is that there is a central role in trade. Okay, and that is unique from what we've seen, right? They were agrarian, so that, I mean, that's important to note, right? Like the other areas. Okay, so agriculture was still there, and they farmed and did all that, but because of the massive surplus, their main economy and emphasis was on trade. Okay, and all of these societies traded. The difference is that the Indus Valley, that became their main economic value, and this shapes aspects of their society. This is something you will see that's similar with the Minoans, that trade, even though they are an agrarian society, trade is the central focus. So like you're looking at like kind of the characteristics of, okay, what's a defining characteristic, there's a couple we're going to look at, of the Indus Valley civilization. One of them should be that your response should be trade. The fact that even though they did agriculture, their main value and emphasis was trade, and that had a fundamental impact on how their society developed. And it helps explain why they developed so differently from Mesopotamia, because the reality was that they're very different from what we've seen from Mesopotamia and Egypt. And the one kind of difference from those other two societies was that trade was that main value. They manufactured goods. Oops. And there were several things that they had. Here we could put, just to give you an example, cotton. They had ivory, metals, Lapis lazuli was mentioned. Right, so they had these different goods and raw materials, right, that were made. And then what they did with them is that they created an extensive trade network around the region. And this included throughout the area of what becomes India, and into Mesopotamia. So we'll say including Mesopotamia. So we found Harappan goods in Mesopotamia. They also had professional merchants. And there were, we saw this Syria, we mentioned that they had trade, but that wasn't their emphasis. Warfare was. And while you had merchants, there was a much larger focus here on what appears to be professional merchants that created a whole new level of organization and development. And what that means by that is that they created an extensive network of trade routes. And what were considered these kind of oasis trade stops. So we'll put trade stops, where they were mini towns that was entirely built for trade. These were all mostly land-based. They had a few water-based trade routes, but most things appeared to be based on land. And this creates this vast network of trade, and more importantly, again, wealth that you don't see in other areas. Okay, so what you have two main areas that, to look at. I did mention that, like I said, that you had two major cities, and then you had a bunch of smaller towns that were kind of suburbs of these larger cities, and that you had over 100,000 population. The two main ones were, and Harappa, the Harappan civilization was one of the earliest, and then a little bit later, when you kind of had a further increase in population and wealth, you had Mohenjo Daro. And from these two locations, we actually can learn some good amount about the structure of their society. There's still lots of questions, but we can get quite a bit from it. So these two locations were on near the Indus River, and what one of the things that was very unique is that these were carefully planned and constructed before what we think people lived there, right? So, and there may have been some, but then they moved them. So it's possible that, right, as they built, people moved in and relocated. But usually, why this is unique is that usually the cities grow organically, meaning that the roads and buildings are kind of haphazard, that there's not a clear organizational pattern. And what we're going to see with this is that it's very clear that this was all built by a architectural plan. And so at its height, like I said, you had these whole region of over 100,000 people in these cities and outlying towns, but that these two cities in particular, they were very similar. So that's the other thing that's unique. So let's take a look at the map here to get a sense of where the two were. So this is the larger area of, right, you're going to have all of this is going to become India. So they're on the outskirts. Here's Harappa, and here's Mohenjo Daro. And then this is showing one of the water trade routes that they had with Mesopotamia, but they also had some overland ones with trading outposts and stuff there. So right, here's Mesopotamia, here's Egypt, here's the Indus Valley civilization. And then there is India. If you look at the two, here's Mohenjo-Daro and here's Harappa, right? These are decently far away. And so this is what also makes them super unique, is that even within this distance, because it would be one thing to say, okay, these two cities were planned out in very, very similar fashions, and here was one city and here is the other. Well, they're super close, so it almost could be an extension of the past city. But you have Harappa over here that clearly was laid out and planned with, and I'm gonna give you a list of characteristics just to give you a sense of how much planning and uniformity went into this. And then later in time, Mohenjo-Daro was created and followed a lot of those exact same characteristics. They have a few differences, but for the most part, these two cities are very, very similar. This is not something that has occurred before, where you have cities not only, we'll come back to that one here, planned out, right, and organized that way, but that they were far apart in space and time, and yet were mostly uniform in design. And this brings up a lot of questions that we don't have the answers to, particularly like why? You know, what about their society allowed for such uniformity, right? What, and not just over space, but also time. We'll put a few speculations out there in terms of what kind of government or religious structure could maintain that uniformity, but that's what's unique, right? It would be unique enough if I just said, hey, Mohenjo-Daro, this city, had this uniformity in its building and materials and construction, and was clearly planned out and organized pre people, living there, or at least they relocated everyone there after they built it. They built it with the intent of it being a city. That's unique in of itself. But then to say, but there's more, Harappa also has the same characteristics, and it's over on the other side, and it was at a different time, Harappa first and Mohenjo-Daro years later, and they still maintained that uniformity between the two cities. That's fascinating, because that's also unheard of, and it would require a sense of well, I would say uniformity again, but certainly unity in ideas for of the civilization to continue the same process that one city did to continue much, much later. And unfortunately, because we don't have writing, we don't know exactly why that was. But again, we will look at the guesses. But before we get to that, let's look at the characteristics of these two cities. So one, it was built of fired mud brick, right? And carefully planned, as I mentioned already with that one. And not mud brick, but much like Mesopotamia, it was the material that was around, and it's very effective and sturdy. So at this point, there's no reason why you would use something else when you have the ability to make mud brick and at a reasonably good pace. But they did fire it. So right, Mesopotamia at the beginning sun-dried theirs. Here you actually have like a kiln that produced the bricks. And the streets ran at precise angles. So this was planned out, what the angles of the streets would be in these two cities. And both had a main street or thoroughfare, right? And which was 34 feet wide. So again, look at the crazy consistency of like planning. You could, this was large for the main street. Here, we could put this one under here. 2 carts could pass each other safely. So just for you to get a sense of size. And that was large for the time. A lot of the main thoroughfares in other cities were good size, smaller. Smaller roads right around the city were 9 feet wide. And then the buildings were uniform with a few options, right? So that basically almost every building, minus there were communal buildings. So minus what the communal buildings, what probably were mostly homes and perhaps small businesses, were uniform in options. So you had 2 to 3 sizes of building, and they were consistently those 3 sizes. And that's unique in of itself. The fact that they planned and said, we're going to have, building A, building B, building C. Everyone in this city is going to live in A, B, or C. There's not going to be a difference in, people aren't going to come in and construct their home and be like, one random person being like, and I'm going to make mine much, much larger, or I'm going to make mine tiny, or that, however happenstance of putting together a home. No, these were all built with these specific specifications to be those 2 to 3 sizes depending on the area. And many of the buildings were 2 to 3 stories, which is also difficult to have in the ancient world because of just architectural development. Yes, you've got the pyramid, you've got the ziggurat, you have these things with these large scale buildings that they put a lot of their investment in, but homes were not usually 2 to 3 stories high. They were single-story homes in the ancient world. And yet here, most of the buildings were multi-story. The other thing was, right, the brick that the buildings that the houses were built out of were almost identical. Let's see here. Sorry, were almost identical. And there were 2 main sizes of brick. So, right, again, here we have roads that measure the same, houses that measure the same, or a variation of the same. The bricks that they produced to build were measured relatively the same. Interior dimensions of the house were almost identical between the 2 cities. This house is almost identical. And you have the small statuettes that we do have. Again, we don't have, I'll get to that in just a second. I forgot one. This is the technological advancements. Both cities were technologically advanced. Don't want to forget that one, because that's fascinating too, that you look at how more advanced they were than the other societies around them. And the Minoans, this is going to be the same thing. They had a sewage system. They had indoor plumbing. They had indoor toilets that had a system that utilized both the sewage system and the indoor plumbing. And that's crazy advanced. You're not that far steps away from the modern toilets we have today. And then they also had the ability to, not mean to bring that up, heating. So they had the ability for running water and heating. Now, it's not clear if every house had that, but the communal areas, including the Great Bath, were had that, right? So you have this kind of technological advances that took place that kept the cities clean, that kept sewage and wastewater clean from the cities. And then you also had the ability to have indoor plumbing and to have running water. That's very impressive. And then we know that they had communal areas. The two main ones that we know of were the Great Bath, which was a bathing area, and there's some suggestion whether it was, just for communal public bathing, which wasn't, it seems kind of weird to us, but was something that the Romans did as well. It becomes a social activity, or if there was a religious function to it. And then they had a meeting area, what appears to be like a large meeting hall, we'll say. So, and then the last thing, right, the one I'd skip to, they had for art, while we unfortunately don't have the kind of pictorial narrative art, there were lots of small statues or statuettes, and that these had similar size and posture, and both had an emphasis on, and then you had animals, both real and mythical. Okay, so just the fact that the art was very similar. The construction of the cities was so uniform. This just is not heard of at all. So the question then is, where are we on that? Characteristics. I guess we can stick with characteristics here. What does this suggest, right? What does this tell us? Right? And one, in order to pull this off, right, you would have to have a really high functioning central organization. And why that's slightly vague is because we don't know if it was kingship or religion, right? It's not clear. This is what provided the control and uniformity. And more importantly, right, control and uniformity over time and space. And so the possibility is, right, would this be kingship, right, theocracy, and a theocracy would be a religious rule. Okay, so a theocracy is when you have a priest and a religion that was ruling. Because the question is how do you maintain that level of uniformity and people buying into it for over a period of time? It's one thing to get one city to fall in line, but then you have later on down the road, and not just a few years later, you have another city following that same structure and seeming to have the same kind of values and cultural aspects. Right, and kingship doesn't necessarily answer that, because of course the kings that helped with Harappa were not the same kings, if they were kings, that were with Mohenjo Daro. And the other thing, of course, is that we don't have evidence of unfortunately, of like large tombs that would indicate that there were kings, but we don't have evidence that there was a strong centralized religious structure that was in charge. There is some theory of trying to suggest, and this isn't the only one, democratic structures. The thing with that is it's a lot harder with democratic structures to have uniformity. The argument for theocracy is that this would be the easiest to maintain uniformity and control over space and time. But because we have not been able to decipher their writing, ultimately, we don't know, right? Unfortunately, we can't say for certain one way or another, because we don't have the writing. So it's just speculative, because there isn't enough archaeological evidence. Now, if there were massive tombs or pyramids like the Egyptians, or a clear palace, so if there was clear architectural ruins of a palace, of tombs that were clearly for a really strong, wealthy individual, then you might be able to more strongly say, oh, it's definitely some form of kingship. Here are the rulers. Here's where the rulers lived, because that's only what this building would be. But we don't have that. The biggest thing you have are the communal locations, we'll say buildings, which I mentioned were, the Great Bath, the meeting hall, if you will. They also had communal granaries. And this might suggest, again, it could be both kingship or theocracy, that you have, because Egypt had the pharaoh, although there was a hint of theocracy within the Old Kingdom with the pharaoh, where they had the state granaries as well. How communal was it? Was it a state-sponsored granary? Was it a truly kind of like socialistic communal granary? Unsure. But what all of this did is that this doesn't happen unless they are extremely wealthy and prosperous. You cannot have this planning. You cannot have this level of design, of commitment to these buildings unless they were wealthy and prosperous. And that this was definitely, yes, agriculture, right? That's the starting point. But it's more important that what they did is because of the massive surplus, they focused on trade. And trade is what allowed for that type of development. Okay, so that definitely played a significant aspect in that. Let's see. So that's the characteristics. So we're on 4 here. If we're looking at, I talked a little bit about the government, and structure. The thing is, so we'll talk a little bit more, but we'll expand on the government and what we do know. With this, the consistency and uniformity doesn't necessarily have to be from political unity, right? One option is political unity. But again, there's problems with that in terms of the fact that we have no evidence of a palace or tomb or burial site for kings, right? So that, at least, it doesn't make it easy. It would be easier if that was possible, if it was there. And so then, as I mentioned, you have the theocracy, where if you had priests and religious rituals and beliefs that could dictate what they were supposed to do. Theocracy does often allow for stronger control and rule, right? And so this would help explain how they were able to maintain it over such a long time. There is another option, which is the social dimension of unity. And this happens, which is what we'll see develop in India. And so there's some suggestion that this might have been part of actually why the Aryans developed within the Varnas, is potentially that this was somewhat in place in previous, generations with the Indus Valley civilization, which was a caste system. And we don't know this, again, there's no clear-cut proof of this, but a caste system is also super rigid and uniform. And it can, as we'll see when we talk about India next week, it can be very long-lasting. And that, the caste system in India shapes everything about them. The politics, the social, the economic, even the religious is shaped by the caste system. And that's for thousands of years. So, if you had a certain type of caste system that dictated a lot of this, it would allow for that uniformity. But again, it's we don't know, right? That's we'll see this with the Minoans too. Here's what the Minoans at least left more pictorial narratives for us to let us fill in some of the gaps that the architecture and archaeological discoveries discover, and their pictorial narratives fill in some of those gaps. We don't have that here. And so, it is the resounding theme of maybe. It's just so fascinating how different they were from other early Mesopotamia and Egypt and China and even India that develop. They stand out, them and the Minoans stand out as very unique, very technologically advanced. The Minoans and them are far more technologically advanced than the other societies in a lot of these areas with it. And then, of course, for the Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, that the uniformity is absolutely unique. That we don't see that with the Minoans. So that uniformity across time and space is something that wasn't thought possible for a while because it didn't seem realistic for it to be able to happen. And then you have, so the other thing that suggests some type of government structure were the extensive communal quarters or buildings, we'll say. Right, and then so there's suggestion or I guess a variety of suggestions with this, where these communal buildings for soldiers, right? Or scholars, priests, right? These are all just guesses. But you do have communal quarters that suggest that they definitely worked together in a more communal sense than individual aspects. And then even you think about the uniformity of the bricks, that there's a possibility that you would have state-run kilns, right, which would then be controlled by whatever the government structure was, and maybe they had a monopoly, because it's too uniform to not be controlled by a kind of a state-sponsored aspect. If you had individual companies, they'd be making, or people, they'd be making their own bricks however way they wanted. Like, think about Egypt and their bread that they made, the 2 types of loaves of bread that they made for the workers of the pyramids. That uniformity came from a state-sponsored structure. And that's a great example of how and we know for sure that was a state-sponsored thing to create that uniformity, and it was possible because of that. So likewise, these bricks, right? The fact that they were so uniform had to be organized by the political entity in order to have that, because it's a massive undertaking, how much they had to produce to build these 2 cities. And so then that was also looking at, how does that, was it, the government that then had control of this as a monopoly because of that as a business, as a trade? Was it something that the elite established? Again, who knows, because there weren't wealthy graves or kingly quarters or palaces to reinforce that. The other thing was that they did have some defensive, let's see, are we still on? Yeah, here. We know that that there was warfare and military, which is why the suggestion of housing of soldiers as a possibility. They created the lookout towers, the defensive towers, and walls, right, for defense, which alone doesn't necessarily suggest a military on its own, but certainly that suggests that there was fear or of conflict and a need to defend. But there is also evidence of vast expansion, where it appears that they moved to expand through warfare in order to conquer other areas, and specifically fighting throughout the various trade routes. And towns, right? That region was certainly geographically produced less geographical barriers and protections that would have made it more secure. And so this is a very big difference from the Minoans. The Minoans are not going to have warfare, but they were on an island, and so they were protected that way. Here, right, this is definitely connected to geography and the region that they were in. Right, so we'll say, just like Mesopotamia, the lack of geographical protection. Okay, so that also has to be controlled by the government in some form. But again, that could totally be a theocracy, that could be a kingship. You could have a military state, but that's less evident of that. We just don't have enough evidence overall, other than that we know that the trading towns also were equipped with weapons, had weapon stores, and evidence of fighting as well. So in order for them to expand the way that they did within their trade networks, in order to protect the region that they were in, this all required some kind of military organization, and because they went on a program of expansion to protect those regions, to protect their cities, it wasn't just defensive, it was offensive as well, and then you had the defensive component too, and that takes organization and leadership in order to do. Again, that's the problem of Mohenjo, Daro, and Harappa with the Indus Valley civilizations, is it's slightly vague because we only know so much. So let's look at the other ones here. Here are the ruins, and this doesn't show you completely. The next slide will be much clearer in the uniformity of the buildings, although you can kind of see it a little bit back here. Everything's in neat rows, right? And then you can see the road here. It's in a grid-like pattern, right? And grid-like patterns are always, especially when it's more than one area, planned structures. Because when it's done more organically, that doesn't happen. Here is a great example of showcasing this uniformity in size in these buildings, right? They all have that exact kind of spacing and construction of what's left. That is significant uniformity throughout, and this is like this throughout the entire of the cities. Here's an artist reconstruction rendition of what part of the area look. You can kind of see what is the canals here that they had for irrigation. And then kind of the entranceway into the main center with houses, which is a little hard to see, but that are very, very similar. Again, there was more than one. There was 2 to 3 types of buildings, but that it's also in this nice line, right? That's part of a grid-like pattern. I mean, think about Catalhayuk, right? There's one had no roads, but it was just kind of built organically as people added on. And this is like, right, that if you're organizing it as such in these grid-like patterns with straight lines everywhere, that's pre-planned all the way. Here's Mohenjo-Daro. There's the defensive tower and wall that I was talking about, right? That they built pretty imposing defenses, which suggests that they expected or had to deal with invasion. But then again, also that they build these imposing towers. We see some of these actually on the trading outpost as well. Which suggests also that they had to fight to take that region and hold it. And so that military was definitely part of their society. Here's an aerial view of Mohenjo-Daro, where this is you see with the great bath, that communal larger building. And this is the water would be pumped into there, and it had a heating component to it. Again, there's theories on that this was just a communal region that, like with the Romans, men mostly enjoyed visiting, and you could do business. You often did business in Rome. They did business in the public baths, but it was also a form of enjoyment and pleasure too as well. And to get clean. The other suggestion is it might have been a religious connection, but that truly just depends on kind of what the main power probably was. But the sense of, again, this uniformity of we don't see ruins that are this uniform and this laid out elsewhere when they're not pre-planned. And then the last thing was the engraved seals. They have lots of engraved seals. Here's their writing, right? We have lots of evidence of their writing. Unfortunately, we just don't know what it means. And you can see here, hopefully, lots of animals. Animals were very, very popular on these seals, and a lot were like actual animals in the region, but you also had mythical animals that didn't exist, that were part of that. And then that begs the question, were those religious? Were those just, was that part of an important aspect of their religion? Was it just something they enjoyed? Unclear. But obviously the seals were left behind, and these seals would have functioned. They had tokens too. You had this one, the round ones tend to be tokens that weren't like the cylinder seals, but a lot of these seals functioned much like the cylinder seals of Mesopotamia. You could then stamp this, right, so that instead of rolling it, you stamped it into clay, right, and then that made your seal, and that was your name or signature. But they also seem to have tokens, right? And tokens are going to have a different function. Yes, it's art, but it often is connected to religion or potentially economic, right? You could have tokens for grain. Think about not Mesopotamia, Egypt. And when the workers worked for the pyramids, they got these tokens for the state granaries and for bread and beer. That's potentially what those were, but we don't know for sure. For the tokens, the seals, we know what they did with those. Those were like the cylinder seals. But that makes the most sense. Is probably not money as much as that they were tokens for the communal locations and buildings and what that provided to the population, which is connected to the economy. It's just not money. It's just not coinage like we think. Then you have the artwork that they did leave behind. We do have some pottery, right, where you have some vases and cups and bowls and things like that. And you can see not only using some design, but these are mythical creatures, right? I was talking about the mythical creatures. Here are mythical animals. This is an example of mythical animals. These animals never existed. And whether that's just artistic license or it was connected to religion, or stories. Some of them maybe their stories. And then you had all these little figurines. And so it's interesting, right, that their figurines are probably look like the least advanced thing out of their society. They have all this technological advance, and then you have these figurines that kind of look like what a child does in, elementary school. They have some more advanced ones too. So then, were these more for home? Were these ones that were done by just individual families? Were these just done as a hobby? You do have your book showcases a couple that are definitely more advanced too. So you have the more basic figures that were probably from the earlier period of the Harappan area. And then the more advanced ones that, like your book shows, that they suggest, they wonder, in the book it talks about whether this figure was a priest or a king, based on the fact that he was bearded and the way that he was standing. There's some suggestion that looks like it might be, performing a ritual, or it could just be a wealthy person that had it commissioned. We don't know for sure. That's definitely more advanced. So clearly, later in the Indus Valley civilizations, their artwork does get more advanced than this earlier period. But people, right? These are obviously just an emphasis on people or gods, right? It could be representation of gods. Oftentimes in societies, and especially in early ancient societies, they had statuettes of local gods. Sometimes the major deities of the state kind of religious structure, but almost every family in Mesopotamia and Egypt had statuettes of local deities. So it's very possible that these weren't just random people, but they were meant to represent their gods. Unfortunately, again, we still don't know exactly. Everything with this is maybe that might be what it's like. Okay, so lastly then, I think, what were we on here? 4, I think. We'll just go with 4. The decline, how did they end? Why did they end? Because they seem quite powerful and wealthy. Well, ultimately, you could argue that some of it was military expansion fighting. Sure. That probably played a little bit of the role. But the major one was geographical change. And ultimately, agricultural societies are always in danger of collapse if you have a fundamental change in climate or geography, right? That can always end up creating problems for them. So 2 things happen that are very significant in kind of their decline. One was that so you had the climate changed, and with this and then you also had some earthquakes around this time. And these things then, we'll put over here, right, led to a change in route for the Indus River. So if you are settled, which both of the major cities were settled along the Indus River, and it shifts its path away from you, that can be devastating to your success of your agricultural basis. Then you had the Saraswati that dried up. So that you have the loss of one river and a changing route in the other. And this, while the Indus River was still strong, it was now in a slightly different area, which can fundamentally change some of your access to it and how much silt it's leaving in your farmlands. And that's kind of the big aspect there, is you have, from this, you have less annual flooding, right? They had 2 flooding periods and crops. And if you have a new location for silt deposit that is not your farmland, this is all going to impact agricultural production, right? And then if you couple that with some fighting and even not necessarily an increase in military fighting, just the continued, what we see evidence of their expansion in military fighting, but they no longer have the surplus and resources that they had in the past. There's also some suggestion that there could have been, right, disease. With any time you have large populations, you are at risk. Here, I'll write it out. You are at risk for, plagues and diseases that can spread quickly. Certainly the amount of irrigation demands that the agriculture in that area were bringing in could lead to issues with mosquitoes. And people didn't leave all at once. This wasn't a mass attack that destroyed the city. Rather, it was over generations. What begins to happen is that people begin to leave the city. It becomes not as wealthy. The cities, they're not as wealthy. It's not thriving as well. And people began to abandon the city over generations until there simply isn't a large enough population to sustain the cities anymore. So they're abandoned because they end up with not enough wealth and not enough population to maintain them. And so this started in and around 1800 BCE. And by 1000 BCE, right, all were in ruins. So one of the other things to think about with this time frame is that important date that we talked about with the Assyrians. This fits into the time range of 1200 BCE. It starts earlier for the Indus Valley civilization than the other societies. But I guarantee you the impact and events of this period, right, definitely were clearly impacting them at the end. So I don't want it to equate it completely to that they collapsed because of that 1200 BC date that leveled, it didn't physically level, but all major civilizations collapsed around that 1200 BCE period. Right, they were already starting to decline and collapse around 1800. So they started earlier than everyone else. But anything that they were holding on to by 1200 certainly pushed it over the edge. So, by 1000 BC, they were complete ruins. And I would argue that 1200 BC period probably just was the final nail in the coffin. They were already on decline. That last event, there was no way that they were going to recover or hang on from that. Okay, so that's where we're going to end. This is going to lead it open into smaller towns and villages as you lose these larger, massive, technologically advanced cities. And that's going to pave the way for the Aryans, who are nomadic warriors who went around conquering areas but continued to roam and move and migrate to other regions to eventually come in and settle in the area that would become India and become the kind of co-founders, if you will, of Indian civilization. If you had still had the Indus Valley civilization, that might not have opened up the path for the Aryans to come to this region. But because that vacuum of power from this civilization was no longer there, it opened up that opportunity for the Aryans. And so that's what we'll look at next time with India.